One of the biggest fallacies in analysis of the war in Ukraine is treating Russia and China as a united bloc against the Western-led global order. And yes, the two countries do share some common interests, but what brings them together is resistance to two separate status quo policies. Of course, the political ecosystems surrounding Ukraine and Taiwan have similarities, but at the end of the day, they live in separate universes, only tied together by the affiliation between their rivals. And that is creating an interesting dilemma that will soon become front and center for the incoming Trump administration. Therefore, today is a dissection of some competing Pacific and Atlantic priorities, and a trade-off between attriting one of your antagonist's military forces while fattening another side's coffers. So, today, we will start with a brief discussion of how this is not a belief exclusively held by Trump. Then I will cover the current consensus that believes that continued support of Ukraine against Russia is the correct policy. That will take us to the logic behind the China pivot that the Trump administration will soon look to implement. Hint, it is about the oil. Finally, we will cover a few reasons why parsing out the correct policy is a challenge. Whether ending the war in Ukraine will actually put an economic squeeze on China as intended. The complicated reason why Taiwan supports not ending, but rather sending Ukraine armaments. How useful it is to drain Russia in anticipation of a conflict with China. And why letting up on Russia might perversely spark the exact thing with China that the Trump administration wants to stop. But as a preliminary, much of this discussion gets lost as a consequence of Trump's own obsession with ending the war in Ukraine. Moreover, with a seeming lack of interest in where the ceasefire line is drawn, despite clear Western interests in keeping it as far east as possible. In turn, this has created an entire media industry that theorizes how Russia has compromised against Trump, and that the Kremlin is using it to blackmail him into bending to accept more policies that run against Western interests. Today is not an analysis of compromise, though. Regardless of what you think about that, there is a large national security community in favor of making changes in line with Trump's vision. And Trump compromise or not, they are about to take over key roles in the United States government. Now, Trump is not the only one with these kinds of allegations. However, I can guarantee you that Russia does not have compromise against the entire class of policymakers, especially as you move down the food chain. They just think that it is the right policy. As such, we ought to spend some time analyzing the reasoning behind their position, and specifically the China pivot. In part, that is because if you are someone in favor of continuing aid to Ukraine, you probably are not going to get very far with entrenched Trump supporters by focusing on compromise allegations. Rather, a more fruitful conversation would focus on the merits, or lack of merits, for the alternative plan. Depending on your background, you probably heard competing narratives about what is going on here. For example, if you favor left-leaning news outlets, there is a good chance that the story about Tulsi Gabbard's nomination for Director of National Intelligence framed her as being compromised or a Russian asset. Meanwhile, if you favor right-leaning outlets, you are more likely to hear about the split between Trump-aligned senators and Republican but Trump-skeptical senators who remain uncommitted. How do I know all of this? Well, it is thanks to our returning sponsor, Ground News. You already know how Ground News tracks the bias distribution of news articles. For example, that piece about Gabbard received relatively scant attention from the right overall. But did you know that Ground News has a specific page for international blind spots, highlighting stories that one side of the spectrum may have no coverage over? Well, good news. For a limited time, my viewers can get full access to the International Blind Spot feed and receive 50% off their unlimited access Vantage plan exclusively through my link, ground.news/linesonmaps. So head over to that link or scan the QR code to better inform yourself and support this channel. Now to the perspective of the incoming Trump administration. The starting point here is the view that China is the real peer competitor. To recap the post-Cold War narrative, the Soviet Union fell apart, the United States had a decade of unrivaled power, the national security community recognized that China would eventually fill the vacuum that the Soviet Union left behind. But then the United States got distracted by Afghanistan and Iraq for a decade. It is a story arc that we covered in great detail as it relates to the conflict with Taiwan. Finally, though, just as it seemed like the United States was on track to turn its focus across the Pacific, Russia invaded Ukraine. From the Trump administration's perspective, Russia is not a peer competitor. Not like China, anyway. It is a nuisance in Ukraine that ought to be stopped, but not at the cost of turning Ukraine into this generation's Afghan light or Iraqi light distraction. Now, the current consensus in Washington and Europe is that fighting Russia in Ukraine is actually beneficial in the long run for stopping China. The idea here is that Russia and China share a limitless friendship. Therefore, if one day a broader war begins involving China, then Moscow will support Beijing. In turn, the more attrition that Russian troops suffer in Ukraine, the worse positioned Russia will be to provide assistance at a later date. Moreover, Ukraine is not a country that normally would figure into a China-centric conflict. Thus, to use a rather cold-blooded analogy, Ukraine is a chess piece that is on the board, only because Russia has walked into the situation. You get the sense that this possibility at least somewhat concerns Beijing, given Xi's apparent ambivalence about a coalition partner at war. Insofar as the theory holds, the United States is better off exerting effort today to help Ukraine cause disproportionate damage to Russia. That limits what Russia can bring to the table later, leaving the Taiwan coalition in an even better relative position. However, it is not much of a dilemma when the choice is obvious, and given the Trump administration's premise from earlier, there is a competing claim that the United States needs to scale down. The main problem here is money and a lack of crinky cohesiveness. And if you're asking yourself, what the heck is a crinky? Please just give me a minute. On the money side, the war in Ukraine is making China rich. Sanctions placed on Russian energy exports mean that Western importers are no longer bidding up the price on the global oil markets. As a result, China can pay rock-bottom prices, with the only serious competitive pressures coming from India. That has turned into an economic lifeline for Beijing, which is otherwise staring down a massive real estate bubble and a tepid post-pandemic recovery. Of course, China making money is not directly a problem for the United States. In fact, security concerns aside, a more developed China creates new consumers for American goods and services. But in the midst of a geopolitical rivalry, more money leads to more armaments, and more armaments means more coercive power on dimensions that the United States cares about. Now, if Russia and China were truly inseparable regarding security affairs, then funding the Ukrainian war effort would still be the right call. For every cheap barrel of oil that China buys, Russia takes a hit compared to the market price. The process would represent a cash transfer from one side of the partnership to the other. But from the perspective of an outside rival, the net economic effect is a wash. Meanwhile, Ukraine is still militarily draining Russia, and thus, the total coercive effect falls favorably to the West. But that is not the world that we live in. Western alliances work well because there is an underlying consensus regarding how the world ought to be organized. It is a complicated system, so complicated that it will be the subject of our next feature-length documentary. But the important thing here is that, when push comes to shove, you can trust that they will intervene on behalf of each other, even if you should not trust them to throw a baseball. That is why few doubt the enforcement of NATO's Article 5 clause, which declares that an attack on one is an attack on all, despite my frequent warnings to not listen to what leaders say, but rather watch what they do. In contrast, consider the cranky countries, that is, China, Russia, Iran, North Korea, and Yemen's Houthis. And if you hate that name, take solace in the fact that Assad is gone, because previously it was the Crinkies, and I do not have space for all of that on my screen. Syria or not, they have been the subject of newfound attention worldwide since February 2022, but do not share a common goal. Rather, they share a common means to various different ends. The means is a dismantling of the Western-led liberal order. The ends are all over the place. But the key thing for now is that China does not really care about whether Russia captures Ukraine. And it is not a secret either. China often votes as much in the United Nations. But at the same time, Russia does not care much about China capturing Taiwan. As a result, Moscow can draw support from other cranky countries, but the relationships are transactional, like money in exchange for North Korean soldiers. Compare that to Western aid for Ukraine, where military supplies head to Kyiv, but currency is not really coming back in return. Sometimes the transfers are in the form of loans, but then suddenly the loan is forgiven. Consequently, it is possible that in a war between China and Taiwan, Russia mostly sits on the sidelines, similar to how China has mostly sat on the sidelines with Ukraine, happy to take the cheap oil, but not jumping to ship Moscow its desired metal. And that being the case, the continued conflict in Ukraine does not meaningfully reduce expected Russian assistance to China vis-a-vis Taiwan, but it does tax US resources and political capital. And thus, if what you really care about is China, then Ukraine is an unhelpful distraction. Okay, so which perspective is right? Well, again, it would not be much of a dilemma if I could present a clear-cut answer. But there are some not-so-obvious considerations to factor in here. Let's start with the assumption that China will lose access to cheap oil once the war ends. That is not something that the Trump administration can magically will into being. Rather, global sanctions against Russia would have to come down, which means Europe would have to start importing Russian oil once again. Now, could that happen? Well, even if the United States cuts all aid to Ukraine, there is no guarantee that Europe will not increase its own effort to fill the void. Then again, the Trump administration would view that as a win anyway. If the West broadly thinks that European border security and a free Taiwan that produces billions of semiconductors are common goals, then there is a clear division of labor to be had here. Europe is literally right there. Its focus should be on Ukraine. Meanwhile, Taiwan is basically half a world away for both, but the US Navy swims laps around the rest of the world's naval forces, and any Chinese invasion of Taiwan would have to arrive via the Taiwan Strait. So it makes sense for the United States to cover that problem. In any case, the point is that if China is going to continue getting cheap oil one way or another, then you might as well help Ukraine damage Russia as much as it can. For its part, Taiwan initially seems to have a perplexing perspective here. Much of this video has been framed as a constrained optimization problem, with a zero-sum set of resources to be allocated between Ukraine and Taiwan. That is, whatever Ukraine receives, Taiwan does not, and vice versa. Thus, you would think that Taiwan would be urging caution from the United States with its aid packages to Ukraine. And yet, it is exactly the opposite. The discussion coming from the island is that Taiwan wants more aid to Ukraine, not less. Also, did you know that Taiwan's current president took a trip to Hawaii at the end of November? I feel like that is the type of thing that would have been a major news story, if so much else was not going on in the world right now. Or at least it was when the previous president visited California. Anyway, Taipei's reasoning is that the United States needs to improve its arms production industry more generally. And the only way that such Palomalu quality defense will come about is if there are arms earmarked for somewhere right now. Well, Ukraine is the place to ship the bombs. Then, once the war is over, the fixed costs to build the factories will already be paid. They will want to keep exporting, and at that point, Taiwan can get any order at once fulfilled. Given that, you would think that the Trump administration would just defer to Taipei. If the island thinks that today's aid should be directed to Ukraine, why insist otherwise? Unfortunately, it gets more complicated than that. Infrastructure investments to help Ukraine will be geared toward production of weapons intended for land battles. Think of 155mm artillery shells and HIMARS launchers. Taiwan does not want small stockpiles of those things stationed on the island. It wants large stockpiles, as they will be critical to its defense should China make landfall. Furthermore, the timing for this is now. Trying to make those deliveries post-invasion would be prohibitively difficult. Now, from the US perspective, it would be really bad if Taiwan loses the land battle to China. But once China makes this into a battle of armies, Taiwan's value on the global supply chain will be shot anyway. As such, the United States views a straight crisis as a primarily naval battle, and that is where the zero-sum aspect of the situation comes into play. Every dollar that goes into producing weapons for the army is one less dollar that goes into producing more ships. It is a classic Army-Navy battle. Then there is the perspective that Russia has made assistance to Ukraine unnecessary because of its own incompetence. Earlier, we described cheap oil as a cash transfer from one end of the Russia-China axis to the other. And thus, when viewed as a cohesive group, it did not matter who was getting richer. It would still present the same overall problem for the Western coalition. But the conversion of money to materiel is not identical across countries. If you think that Russia's supply chains are riddled with corruption, which they were, as the Battle of Kiev attests to, then the West would actually want more money on Russia's end, not China's. That is because Russia would produce fewer tanks and more ill-gotten wealth for bureaucrats, while China would produce more tanks and less ill-gotten wealth for bureaucrats. The counter-argument here is that Russia has cracked down on those issues once they became apparent. That is how Russian troops have made substantial gains in the second half of 2024, after 2 years of floundering around in Ukraine. Meantime, China has its own problems with corruption. Putting the pieces together, the whole converting money into materiel calculation is a wash, and you might as well go after the thing that is the clear and present danger. And if you are so concerned about China using cheap oil to grow its economy, why not just step up sanctions against Beijing until it relents from importing the stuff? Ending the war in Ukraine seems like a roundabout solution to the problem, with a lot of downsides, rather than the more direct route of punishing the exploit. And it is not like Trump needs an excuse to put sanctions on another country. Finally, I will leave you with a more complicated incentive that I have not yet seen be a part of the conversation. If there is one thing that you should have learned from this channel, it is that wars are inefficient, and that gives rise to a set of possible settlements, which, in principle, are mutually preferable to war. But if there is a second thing that you should have learned, it is that we cannot intelligently discuss how to manipulate a conflict without first articulating the bargaining friction that is either currently forcing a war to continue, or could potentially cause a war to start. With that as our preface, recall how that 90-minute discussion of tensions between China and Taiwan covered the bizarre flip in war concerns over the last 15 years. Namely, once upon a time, the worry was that the United States or Taiwan would have incentive to initiate a more active conflict at a time before China had completed its rise in power. But then China's economic woes and plummeting birth rate suddenly made it seem like China was currently at the peak of its power. How the turntables. China will soon hit a steep demographic decline, and thus the onus is on Beijing to start the conflict. Insofar as you think that this could spark a war along the strait, then cheap oil is actually helpful. Every day that China does not invade is a long-run win for Taiwan and the West. Well, one of the classic anti-preventive war strategies is to overpay the declining power in the present. The long-run inevitable negative consequences appear more palatable when you get to live like a king in the meantime. And that, more or less, is an effect of the cheap oil. So, cut that, and risk causing the bigger problem that you ostensibly wanted to avoid. Strange? Yes. But welcome to the complicated world of geopolitics. Meanwhile, what is not complicated is the crystal clear explanations of the war that you will find in these two books. Ordering them is not complicated either, because you can just click on the link in the video description. And if you enjoyed this video, please like, share, and subscribe, and I will see you next time. Take care.